Hello and welcome back to Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast that celebrates all things art historical with me, your host and resident art historian, Jo McLaughlin. Hello, welcome back. It is episode 68, and this week on the podcast I am bringing back a series that I started right back, I think on episode 3 or 4 of the podcast, and that is my Art of the Deal, or Art of the Dealer series. This is a series where I deep dive into one of art history's and the art market's most exciting, forward-thinking and trailblazing art dealers. Because in my opinion, the art world works the way that it does today because of these dealers. Currently, I've had episodes on Paul Durand-Ruel, Joseph Devine, Peggy Guggenheim and Leo Castelli, and today taking centre stage is, for the first time, a living art dealer who has really had a monumental impact on contemporary art, the contemporary art world, and how art is bought and sold today. And that, of course, is Larry Gagosian. Larry Gagosian himself has established his galleries, Gagosian Galleries, as this global empire and collection of galleries and real estate across the world. Currently, Gagosian has 19 galleries to his name, and he really was a trailblazer, and is rather a trailblazer, in how art is bought and sold and how collectors interact and how artists are represented by their gallery. He is someone that, just to give you a sense of the types of artists that he deals with, Amzin Kiefer, Damien Hirst, Helen Frankenhalter, Donald Judd. He also has dealings in part with running the estates of Picasso, Warhol and William de Kooning. And he, of course, has worked with the revolutionary British painter Jenny Saville since 1997, so really not too long after she came out of university. I think she was 26 when she signed to Gagosian's books and has been part of the gallery roster ever since. And he also had a really long-standing relationship and dealership rather with Cy Twombly, who's one of the great American artists. And yeah, Gagosian was his gallerist for about 30 years, so a really, by today's standard, long-term running partnership with the artist. And really what I'm looking to do in this episode today is really sort of dig down into 5 or 6 really key points about Larry Gagosian and why I consider him to be one of the greatest art dealers of all time. So we're going to look at how it all started, where his foundings and introduction to the art world happened, where his big break came from, because, as I've mentioned in another episode before, he was very good friends with a previous dealer that I've discussed in this podcast. And then I want to look into how those relationships helped him become who he is today. And I also want to look at his contribution to the contemporary art world. What exactly has he contributed that probably people hadn't done before, or had done, and he's put his Larry Gagosian spin on it? And finally, what is the future for the Gagosian empire? This has been a subject of conversation over the last 2 years. In late 2022, early 2023, Gagosian announced that he had a brand new board of advisors. These would be the people that would not only spearhead the direction of the gallery going forward into the future, but also, as a 78-year-old dealer, we're really going to sort of take the reins from Larry once he eventually steps down. However, in my opinion, I don't think he's ever going to step down. I think he'll be there until he politely bows out of this world. Anyway, I am really excited to bring this to you. I really hope you enjoy it. And yeah, sit back and relax as we discuss all things Larry Gagosian. So Larry Gagosian, where did it all start? So Larry Gagosian was, of course, born in America, and he was born in April 1945. There's quite a lot of interviews and things written on Larry Gagosian. He's in a lot of books about art dealers, about the boom and bust of the industry. But in all of these things, he very much emphasises that he did not have a visual art upbringing. It was not something, he didn't go to museums and visit them. His parents weren't really interested in it. His father, for example, was an accountant who later became a stockbroker. But it's important to note that his parents were and sort of dabbled in showbiz ever so slightly. His mum had a small acting career where she appeared in an Orson Welles movie once. And essentially, yeah, that was the only exposure really as a small child that he had to it. And I think I know a lot of artists listen to this podcast, and I actually really quite meanly took a lot of joy in being like, oh my goodness, even someone like Larry Gagosian has had times in their life like this. He was actually and has been described as a bit of a deadbeat, particularly from his father. Essentially, he was a bit of a waster and really didn't know what he wanted to do. He dropped in and out of university. He actually went to study English, dropped out twice, went back. And he eventually graduated college, and he had a string of menial jobs. He worked in a record store, he worked in a grocery store, he did the graveyard shift at a gas station, and then it was through his cousin that he was introduced and got a job at the William Morris Agency, and he was answering phones and reading scripts for people. And eventually he kind of walked away from this. There's a little bit of back and forth and sort of contradictory. This is the whole thing, this will be a theme throughout the podcast. There'll be loads of people that say one thing and then Gagosian will deny it. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. But essentially he says he was fired from this job. Sources said, no, we didn't want him. We didn't fire him. He quit and walked out. Yeah, his father was essentially like, please, can you just do something with yourself? He then got a job as a parking attendant in Westwood, and he didn't mind the job, said it paid him better than what he'd been paid previously, and it sort of wasn't going anywhere. However, what is well documented, although I didn't know this, it was completely brand new information to me, was that one day walking down the street, he came across this guy who was selling posters on the side of the road. And Gagosian says, they weren't the best looking posters, but it was an interesting model. This guy was making good money on these posters. People were interested in them. So he started talking to the person and said, where do you source your work from? So he said, oh, it's this company here. And Gagosian reached out to the company, bought them directly from the company, haggled a bit of a deal, and then essentially copied the guy's model. And then as he started doing that, he was making a little bit of money. And then he realised by adding a really cheap frame to the prints that he was selling on the street, by adding a $2-3 frame, you could raise the price of a print that you would maybe charge $3 to $5 for and actually charge $15 to $20. So you could make quite a substantial markup just by aesthetically changing how somebody comes across something for the first time. And this model really began to take off. He then leased a patio in Westwood, and then he sold framed posters to passers-by. And so he's been this has sort of been coined as the moment where his slacker instincts, and there was a whole comment where, in an article that I read, that his dad was like, please stop buying weed. He was apparently a huge waste of space and really wasn't doing anything with himself. So this chance meeting on a corner of someone selling posters really set Gagosian off to becoming the greatest art dealer that's living now. It's just really, really incredible. Anyway, so he got this patio, he was selling posters to passers-by, and then because of the traction it was getting, he then began to lease the space out to people. So he would allow leather workers and sculptors, ceramicists. He would give them a small section of the patio to sell their stuff, and he would, as well as charging them to take a little space in the patio, he would then take a certain percentage of their takings as well, which is just very savvy businessman skill. So you can see where it's starting to sort of form and really sort of understand the idea that these works and selling crafts and arts really can take you somewhere. Anyway, he eventually moved out of the patio and went into what we would call a gallery space, so a shop front really, where he was selling posters and crafts and all sorts of things like that. And where the big changing point came was one night he was flicking through a magazine and he came across a New York photographer. And this was in the mid-70s. So it was a New York photographer called Ralph Gibson. And Gagosian called Gibson and essentially just said to him, I've got this gallery. It's on the West Coast. How about a West Coast exhibition? And Gibson, who is a photographer, said, well, sure, okay, but you have to buy 3 or 4 of the works as like a guarantee that I'm going to make any money. So Gagosian then got on a flight to New York with a check in hand and went to Gibson's art dealer, who was Leo Castelli. Now, at the time, Gibson wasn't selling his works for hundreds and hundreds or hundreds of thousands of pounds. He was selling work for about $200, $300 at the time. Anyway, so he went and met Leo Castelli, and apparently the rest is history. Leo really took to Gagosian's thirst and hunger and drive to succeed, and just his sort of get up and go attitude to make things happen. So Leo Castelli agreed the photographer could have an exhibition in Leo's West Coast space, and from that moment they became really, really good friends. And Gagosian really sort of looked to Leo Castelli as a mentor, as a friend. But at this point in time, Castelli was dealing with the millionaires of New York, any sort of new up-and-coming primary artist he was dealing with. And Castelli was a dealer who really specialised in primary market. And what I mean by the primary market is essentially they were purchasing or taking works directly from an artist's studio. So the artist would make them, and maybe a couple of weeks later they would be in Castelli's gallery, and he was selling them to contemporary collectors. And at the time, he was working with people like Jasper John and William de Kooning. So people that now we know as huge, big art historical names, but at the time they were very much up and coming. He also dealt a lot with Roy Lichtenstein as well. And I think he actually represents, obviously Leo Castelli's passed away now, but I do believe the Castelli Gallery still represents the Lichtenstein estate. Anyway, now the friendship and mentorship really developed over a couple of years, and actually there was a really funny quote that I found from Diane Bell, who is also a photographer, and said essentially that Gagosian followed Castelli around like a puppy. And there's this anecdote where there was this day where him and Castelli, where Gagosian and Castelli were walking in New York, and Castelli said, "Oh, hi, this is such and such, how you doing?" There was this really lovely anecdote that I read, and actually there's a lot of really good articles, as I've said previously, written on Larry Gagosian. There's an incredible long read feature that was released middle of last year in the New Yorker, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes below. It's a 2-hour long listen, so they have someone that's essentially reading the article out to you, or if you're a very fast reader, I'm sure you could get through it in quicker than an hour, but essentially I began listening to it, and it's an unbelievable deep dive into Gagosian's life. I think you'll really, really enjoy it, and I'll leave a link to the show notes below. But in this article in the New Yorker, there was this anecdote mentioned where Leo Castelli and Larry Gagosian were having a walk one day in New York, and Castelli, who knew everybody, said hi to someone, and he walked on, and Gagosian said, "Who on earth was that?" And he said, "He's one of the richest guys in New York. He can buy whatever he wants." And Gagosian double backed, left Castelli, and just said to him, "Hey, give me your number. I'm going to sell you some art." And he did. And Castelli was very generous. Castelli was known for like handing his phone book out to people as well. Like he really did champion young dealers and young gallerists. And if you want to know a little bit more about Castelli, do listen to my episode on him. If you go back into the series, you will find my episode on Castelli. I think it's round about the 39, 38 mark. Please don't quote me on that, but it is somewhere back in those sort of lower digits of the podcast. And yeah, essentially, so Castelli really was a core reason for Larry not only growing his understanding of how to be a lucrative art dealer, but also growing his network in terms of clients. And what was really generous, I feel, for Castelli is that, you know, Larry wasn't working out of New York, he was working out of the West Coast and in California. And he was happily loaning works to Larry Gagosian to show in his gallery, to sell to his clients there. And it was a whole untapped network of people that Larry was able to reach. So yeah, that's kind of where it all started, and really where his big break came from was being introduced to Leo Castelli purely from picking up the phone and cold calling an artist, and then a meeting that completely changed his life and circumstances. So what has Larry Gagosian contributed to the contemporary art world that has allowed him to emerge as such a great dealer? He has done loads and loads of things. I mentioned it previously, this is essentially how he met Leo Castelli, through an artist, he really was not afraid to pick up the phone and cold call people. This is something I don't think is done too much. I know in the company that I work for, Acrylicize, we have an incredible new business team, but I just don't think cold calling is the same as what it was. It's now you sort of send an email and sort of cross your fingers and hope for the best. But he really, really, really wasn't afraid to call people and let him know where his gallery was, what he was doing, the types of artists he was representing. And it's said that at some points in his life, he was making up to 100 cold calls a day in order to get a lead and a sale. And this is something that he used to his advantage, particularly when he began researching other great art dealers in art history. And Gagosian himself says one of his favourite topics to discuss ever is the life and work of art dealer Sir Joseph Devine, who I also have a podcast episode on if you want to go back. That's about episode 6, and I know that for a fact. That's episode 6 in the podcast season. I too am obsessed with Joseph Devine. He was a cheeky chappie that really used psychology against people. He really understood the insecurities of the wealthy of particularly New York, where he was working, and just used it to his advantage to further himself, his business, and the artists that he was selling. It's really interesting that great dealers look to other great dealers as inspiration, and also lovely for me that I believe these people are the greats and their names keep cropping up as I research more and more into this season. Anyway, cold calling clients. So this is something that essentially Larry Gagosian right in the beginning kind of began to sort of twig that certain people would love to get their hands on certain works, but they didn't know where they were. And Larry, having no problem calling absolutely anybody and everybody, would essentially speak to clients and say, what work do you want the most? And they would say, oh, I want this William de Kooning, or oh, I want this Lichtenstein, or oh, I want this. And through his connections with Leo Castelli, would then begin cold calling lots of different clients and trying to track down where these works went. And essentially he would cold call clients, or owners rather, of works and say, hi, I've got someone that's really interested in your painting that you have by Matisse. I think I could get you 20 million for it. What do you think? And that is a model that he really sort of took and ran with. However, it's kind of got him in a bit of trouble. And of course, I think with every great business, you're always going to ruffle feathers, and I think there's always going to be controversy around it. And I think how you conduct yourself is very important, but you're not always going to please everybody. I think that's just a fact of life. And when reading about Gagosian, there was points, and I'll get onto this later, but there's points where I was sort of like, oh, that's just a bit of poor form. But really interestingly, he denies doing lots of things, but there's been lots of people that have come back and said, no, he absolutely did do that. I was in the room and he did it, or I saw it with my own eyes, sort of thing. But something that he was known for doing in terms of like pushing himself forward, a bit like Joseph Devine, was essentially just turning up at house parties and being like, no, I am invited, and essentially bluffing his way into these spaces, networking with the elites of New York or wherever he was finding himself. And then going around, what he would do is once sort of the party got started and everyone sat down for dinner, because there was no space for him at dinner, he would then just wander the house with a Polaroid camera and start taking photos of people's artworks. Now, I took this from the New Yorker article, which I was just sort of like, God, it's so cheeky, but also like so savvy as well. Essentially, he would walk around these wealthy people's collections. He would take Polaroid pictures of works in their collection without them knowing, and then he would go to his collectors and say, I can get you this painting for this amount of money, and then call up the host of the party a couple of days later and say, hi, it's Larry, thanks for a really good night. By the way, I've got a buyer who's interested in X, Y, and Z paintings that are in your collection. Are you interested in selling them? And the psychology of this is everything is for sale if the price is right. And by being the broker between these ultra elite people, he really did sort of pave the way for these like massive Uber collectors who exchange bonkers amount of money between each other, because art was suddenly becoming this asset that was a hot ticket and something that held its value as well, which is increasingly important. So something else that he did was he moved to New York in 1985. He left his West Coast gallery and he came to New York, 1985, and he bought a huge sprawling gallery space in Chelsea. And fun fact, Chelsea, New York in 1985 was considered a rough area. And people were kind of like, why on earth are you doing this? Like, why have you bought this huge space? However, now Chelsea, one of the hottest places to own property, his investment paid off. So he seemed to have a very good business head and foresight about purchasing property in the city. And what this allowed him to do was put on, really for the first time, instead of these very sort of small, intimate shows, he would buy this huge space and curate these almost museum quality retrospectives of contemporary artists, and alongside it publish the most exquisite catalogues with art historians that have been commissioned to write essays on the topic, and all these really beautiful in-depth photography of the works that he was selling. And he really played on that idea of owning a piece of history, again, very much kind of like what Devine did. Like, you're becoming part of the narrative of these pieces, even though they're contemporary, you are owning something that really should belong in a museum. And I find that a very interesting trait. Something else that he did in terms of like buying these incredible spaces, or buying the space in New York, he expanded. He really was not afraid to put his money where his mouth was. And he expanded into London, Rome, and Paris very, very quickly after the success of his New York show. And I think now he's definitely got multiple sites in New York. And I think he has 2 or 3 sites in London, maybe 2 sites in London. And again, they're beautiful, beautiful, stunning, stunning spaces. They're really sleek. Really, everything has room to breathe. It's never like, you never walk in and think, oh, it's a bit much. If you ever walk into Gagosian space, which, by the way, it is always free to walk into a Gagosian gallery. Doesn't matter if you can afford to buy the work or not. You probably can't if you're like me. But they are beautiful shows. That he put on a Rachel Whiteread show just after COVID, and it was so stunning and so powerful. Yeah, they just show great artists. Yeah, okay, the staff are a little rude, but yeah, kind of that's the vibe of the space, isn't it? Anyway, right, so yeah, he expanded, and he's really one of the first gallerists to really do that. Also, fun fact, he hates being called a gallerist. He, for himself, he's like, I am an art dealer through and through. I have galleries, but I am not a gallerist. I am a dealer, and I'm unapologetically so a dealer, which, fair enough, own it what you are. And as I said in my introduction, he now has 19 sites across the world, which is really just incredible. And there really only is a handful of galleries that have done that. So of course, Gagosian, you have Hauser and Worth, and then maybe Pace Gallery as well. They've got multiple sites all over the world. But really, these big institutions, like the last 2 that I named, they're all family run. This is just Gagosian on his own, being savvy, taking opportunities and not being afraid to play with big money. It's really, really incredible. Now, another thing that he's been able to do to sort of help spearhead himself as one of the greatest dealers of all time, because he's buying all these spaces and he has all these connections within the art world, he really does use that to allow his artists to push themselves creatively. Richard Sierra, who is just the most incredible sculptor, he does these unbelievably huge, all-consuming pieces. And I've been to a Richard Sierra show in Gagosian, the one that's on Britannia Street in King's Cross. And I just felt completely engulfed by these things. They had to take the roof off the building in order to get these works in. It was so exciting. And he just, of course, he has the money to play with it, but he's not afraid to spend it to push his artists and what he's able to let them do in terms of scale and experimentation. It really is a huge benefit. And I understand he can't do that for every single artist on his roster. He's got over 100 now. But it's just an incredible feat that this one guy has all these gallery spaces, and his whole point is to push artists to make bigger, better works that, of course, he can then sell for bigger, punchier prices. It's a full circle economy. But I think it's really incredible. And someone who really credits Gagosian for helping project her career forward is the British painter Jenny Saville. You can love her or hate her. I think she's incredible. One of her first works, Propped, I actually have a bite-sized episode, so it's about a 10-minute long episode on really the first piece that brought her to prominence, and it was actually Charles Saatchi that purchased it when she was a student up in Scotland. But Jenny Saville, as I mentioned in the introduction, signed at the age of 26 in 1997 to Gagosian's roster and is still there today. And actually, she's now on his board of advisors, which I think is incredible. And essentially, she said, he's been able to push me as an artist. I really value his opinion. And he's been able to arrange for her to spend afternoons in William de Koenig's old studio, which essentially was left untouched. And she says, she spent the day looking at sort of how this master painted, the brushes he used, the textiles on materials and all sorts of things like that. And she's essentially just said, I probably had 10 years of development in one day, and that was all because Larry Gagosian used his connections to help me develop as an artist. And I just think that's incredible. Something else that I've really enjoyed while reading about Larry Gagosian is his sheer sharpness when it comes to being observant of the things that are happening around him, not just in the art world. There was an incredible example given in the New Yorker article that I read, I listened to it, where essentially Steve Cohen, who is one of the most wealthiest people in the world, he essentially, I think it was back in 2020, he spent $2.4 billion buying the Mets baseball team. And Gagosian was like, okay, so he's just spent that amount of money buying something. I bet he would be more than happy selling a couple of his paintings, having sold quite a lot of very punchy price pieces to Cohen. And essentially, he then negated a sale of a Giacometti sculpture for about $147 million, purely by picking up the phone and saying, hey, are you in the mood to sell some art? I've probably got a buyer for your Giacometti and I can get you this for it. And he was like, absolutely, sell it. I just think that's really savvy. It's really clever. Maybe it's obvious to everyone listening, but I wouldn't think, oh gosh, you've just bought something really punchy, you're probably going to be looking to sell something. I just think it's great. Really, really clever. Now, for all the good that Gagosian has done in terms of developing this multi-site global empire that he has, as I've mentioned a few times, there has been quite a bit of controversy with the dealer. So his categoric shot to success when he moved to New York and bought his big space and was doing all this stuff, there was a lot of quite damaging rumors that essentially he had a backer of some kind, and that was either like gangs or it was drug dealers or arm dealers. And Gagosian has essentially said, like, that's nonsense. Like, if it was those sorts of things, people wouldn't have bought from me. If they truly believed it, they wouldn't have bought from me. And I don't know if it's true, but I would like to think it was probably Castelli who was again just opening his phone book to Gagosian and saying, right, you've got a show on, let's get some of my collectors down there, let's see what we can do for you. I think it was more that than anything, and probably just, a bit of sort of sourness and bitterness for people that were trying to do something similar and it wasn't taking off as quickly because obviously he had access to Castelli. There's also been some criticism around him building this sort of global gallery empire because it very much devalues what small galleries and mid-sized galleries try to do. So small and mid-sized galleries very much champion the up-and-coming, the straight out of university, mid-career or emerging artists. And it used to be that essentially when you had a gallery, you signed on to the gallery and you were more or less there for the rest of your career. However, what Gagosian has been accused of is essentially poaching artists. Once a young gallery or a mid-sized gallery has nurtured a talent, has allowed a collectorship to build up behind this artist, essentially Gagosian then sort of swoop in, and Gagosian's not the only one to do it, swoop in and sort of offer them more resources, better spaces, better access to dealers and better access to buyers who can meet punchier price points. And they, of course, go with Gagosian because Gagosian can provide them with assets and access to things that small to medium-sized galleries just can't. Now, as I said, I don't think Gagosian is the only one to do that. And Gagosian himself has said he doesn't poach. It's not really in his nature. But I think there's been more than enough evidence that suggests, yes, they can be poached. And also it's happened to him as well. He's had some really big ticket artists over the years. And of course, it's happened to Gagosian as well. He himself has had some big ticket artists on his roster leave suddenly and go to another superstar gallery because essentially it just wasn't working for them. I think it's the nature of the beast. And actually, I think it's great that artists have that power now that they can say, actually, no, this isn't working for me. I need a gallery that's going to back me and come and do studio visits and things like that. And on the subject of studio visits, there was quite a lot of artists when I've been reading some articles that were essentially like, Gagosian has over 100 artists in his stable. He has over 19 sites and he's constantly entertaining and having parties and doing all these sorts of things. He cannot physically make every single opening. And I think for an artist, your opening night of a show that you've spent months, sometimes years working towards, to have the director of a gallery there really signifies to you their commitment to you as an artist and your practice and their belief in your work. And I think to have such a pivotal person not be present is quite disappointing. When I worked in art galleries, one of our directors lived and worked in Gloucestershire, and they always made sure that every single opening we had, regardless of turnout or how established they were on the roster, they were there every single time. And it really does mean a lot to people when you show face, particularly if you're the person that is financially backing them. I also want to point out, in terms of controversy, I don't really condone what he did with the Polaroid things going around people's house. You might remember earlier I mentioned that he would sort of wangle his way into dinner parties and then sort of mingle with people, and as everyone sat down for dinner, obviously there was no space for him because he wasn't invited, and he would just take himself off to wander your house. I think it's really cheeky, it's really ballsy, but I also just think it's just so rude, like taking photos of people's houses. I just don't think it's not the worst thing you can do in the world, but I just think there's better ways to do it. But hey, it got him some sales, and you might disagree with me. It shows how savvy he is and how hungry he was to be successful, if cheeky. Finally, in terms of the controversy that surrounds the dealer, I think it would be very unfeminist of me to not highlight the fact that in several accounts and articles that I have been reading, there has been accusations of sexual harassment towards women. There was a whole section in the New Yorker article, which of course Larry Gagosian has completely denied, but there's a whole section that talks about how he was kind of known for calling up women and leaving them or having very aggressively charged and just not very nice phone messages, sort of sexual deviant stuff. And he's denied it. There's been lots of people that have said, no, it absolutely happened. They've had husbands being like, I was in the room when she got the phone call. Yeah, I think wouldn't be right for me not to mention that. But apparently since this was sort of in the 70s and early 80s, and apparently after he moved to New York, apparently these phone calls stopped happening. But there's a bit of a history there, and I think that's a controversy. However, he does have an incredible amount of female artists on his roster, so perhaps it was a silly young boy thing, but nice to know that they did stop by the time he moved to New York in 1985. And I suppose on the subject of that, I was reading that he is a great entertainer. He has a weakness for entertaining people. He loves hosting parties. He loves having people come over to his multiple houses, but there's always a motive behind these things. And one of his old directors has been quoted by saying he was a full-time dealer and a part-time casting agent. And essentially these parties that Larry Gagosian hosts, they're all carefully curated with the right billionaires, the right models, the right actors and actresses. And essentially it's to make the party as exciting as possible. But essentially Gagosian's been quoted in this New York article being like, models are very important at parties because more than anything, they look great at a dinner table, which is so shallow, but also, yeah, it's the art world. it is a bit shallow. Like, you have to look great and everyone has to be pencil. You don't have to be pencil thin, but in the art world, it seems that anyone that's anyone is pencil thin and hasn't eaten a sandwich since 1985. Yeah, I find it interesting that everything's very carefully orchestrated and he doesn't stop working, essentially, I think is what I'm trying to say. Like, he's just always on. He's always looking for a sale. He's always chasing that. And he also lets billionaires just stay at his house because essentially he even says himself, like, the works in my collection aren't for sale, but everything has a price, so they can be. And yeah, I think that's an interesting way to live your life. He's obviously found something that he loves and he's very passionate about it. And I think it's such a 180 from someone who was working in a gas station at some point or had been fired for not being very good, or his dad accused him of like smoking too much weed and just being a bit of a deadbeat, to becoming the world's most successful living contemporary art dealer. It's just bonkers, absolutely bonkers. So, as Gagosian is still living, and he is the ripe old age of 78, he's still going strong, still hosting parties left, right and centre. So what's next for Gagosian Galleries? Well, in my opinion, I think he will expand further. I think at the time of recording, this is February 2024, he has 19 galleries to his name. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 5 years that creeps up to sort of mid-20s. It really wouldn't surprise me. And what he did do in 2022 was announce a new board of advisors. And this was essentially, it was 8 internal and 12 external people. His internal people were essentially mostly his directors, and who have actually been quoted as saying, like, the directors are like his children. So he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have kids, not that you need those things, but essentially there's a huge conversation at the moment of the legacy of the gallery and who is he going to leave it to, because he has no children to inherit it. But I think the consensus is it will be left to his sort of favourite directors who he looks upon as children. But in a very sort of weird, don't ever turn your phone off sort of way, I was reading this thing where essentially if he tries to call one of his directors, and he calls directors every single day, if he cannot get hold of you, he will call you and call you and call you and then send a company-wide email asking why he can't get hold of you, which I think is really quite terrifying. And he has been described as ruthless, actually. Like, he's not this like soft bunny rabbit, very refined dealer like perhaps Leo Castelli was known to be. He has been described as a total tiger and someone that you wouldn't want to cross. Ruthless is the word that's used, and that's just how he is in business. But I think you can't really get to where he is without being a bit ruthless. Anyway, as I was saying, in 2022, he announced a new board of directors, 8 of whom were directors from across the world, and 12 are external people. So he has people like filmmakers and artists and PR advisors and all sorts of things like that, who have really come together working alongside Gagosian, Larry Gagosian, who's also on the board, to help guide and steer the next generation of Gagosian, not just while he's living, but after he is gone as well. So for the Gagosian Empire, what's next? Well, the world's his oyster. I think it could be quite literally anything. And there you have it. That is my episode on Larry Gagosian for my series, The Art of the Dealer. I hope you've enjoyed it. So finally, before I sign off, what are my thoughts on Larry Gagosian? Well, I think it's really interesting that he looked to the greats like Sir Joseph Devine, like Leo Castelli, to really help guide him and steer him of how he should behave himself in the art world. I have nothing but admiration for the hunger and determination and the sheer audacity, really, of his ability to cold call, to walk into parties, how would we say it now? He had no shits to give, and that has gotten him so far. He didn't care about how he was perceived unless it was the right types of people. He didn't care if he ruffled feathers. He wanted into these spaces and he got himself in there. And I think it really is just incredible. He's one person who started selling posters on the side of a road, that then moved into a patio, that then moved into a shop front, and then just became this huge global gazillionaire art dealer. it really is incredible. Has he stepped on some toes? Absolutely. Has anyone that's gotten anywhere not stepped on toes? No, of course you're going to do that. I think the fact that he's got so many artists, I think that he's incredibly respected within the art world, and it's somebody that, as a gallery, once you're sort of associated with them, that you really are on the up and up when Gagosian has you, because again, they can expose you. They have an infinite amount of resources in terms of marketing and media and gallery space and collectors, global collector database that all run under the name of Gagosian. Incredible. It is really just incredible. And what's next for the future of Gagosian? I think anything, really. I wouldn't be surprised if there was more galleries opening up. I wouldn't be surprised if the empire would grow. And what I don't think will happen, I don't think he'll ever step down. I really can't see him announcing that he is going to step down and just sort of sit very quietly. As I said, he's 78 years old. He's not going anywhere. I think he will be in this position until he politely bows out of the world. And why not? He's built this global empire purely for the love of it, and the love of art, but also the love of money, and has given himself and the world this insane model that you can aspire to be part of. It's incredible. And there you have it. That is my take on Larry Gagosian for my series, The Art of the Dealer. I hope you've enjoyed it. And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please make sure to like, rate and subscribe. It does really help in letting other people find us. You can listen to Jo's Art History podcast on any streaming platform, and you can also watch it in a video format on YouTube. If you would like to support the podcast in any way, I have now released an Amazon wish list, which you can also find in the show notes below. This will allow you to donate in part or purchase in full an art historical text that is of interest to me and that will help in research towards future episodes. And it would be really wonderful if you've listened to quite a lot of these, if you could buy that as a way of marking patronage towards the podcast. That would be brilliant. If you would like to get in touch, please do. It's always lovely to hear from people. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with me via Instagram, which is @joesarthistory, or you can search for my name, Jo McLaughlin, via Instagram, and you will find me there. That's all we have from the podcast this week. Thank you so much for listening. Once again, I'll remind you to keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.